Hi, I'm Andre. Welcome back to Metapunk Zero. In this episode, I'm going to do another installment of the Psychosis Diaries, and we're going to be talking about what causes psychosis. Thank you for joining me. All right, welcome back. So, before I begin, I want to make a brief clarification about my previous video. I talked about psychosis from an experiential point of view, and I was concerned that maybe I left the viewer with the sense that my family didn't care about me, and that's not the case. They really do. And I think my family and friends did the very best that they could to try to support me as well as they were able during the experience. Having said that, they weren't able to support me as well as I needed, and not because they didn't try and not because they didn't care. There's some factors in that, and those are mainly what I'm going to be talking about on this entire playlist of Psychosis Diaries entries. And in a nutshell, doctors don't understand psychosis. That's the main point that needs to be made. Doctors really don't understand it. It's not an organic brain disease primarily. There are organic factors that go into psychosis. Certain instances of psychosis are surely organic in nature, but I will contend that most instances of psychosis are relational in nature. And I'm going to talk about that in this video. I kind of will segue to that in a minute, but I suffered, I think, because I had a lot of isolation that went into my psychosis, like going into it. I had been isolated by COVID and by work situations and by sheer geography and economics. Like I had to move for work and my family had to move for work and all of those things. So we're very scattered across the countryside. As a result, I was very isolated. COVID happened, very isolated for 4 years, and I had a lot of income insecurity. I didn't have stable employment. I had a job, but it was not a job that provided stable hours or stable income. And so that was really a big factor. And then when I tried to find better employment, I wasn't able to do it. And so I wasn't sure how secure my housing was. I wasn't sure how secure my ability to eat was. I didn't know what was going to happen. And I was very isolated during that experience. And so that's what created my psychosis. I didn't just have a spontaneous brain disease. And the fact that the doctors would look at it that way is really a problem because it doesn't at all take into account the actual factors that created the disease. And so, as much as they can treat with medications, and some of those maybe do help, I don't know. The jury's out on that because there's a lot of side effects, there's a lot of things about that. I can say that in my case, I continue to take my meds. I don't even call them my meds, honestly. I call them the meds because I don't want to identify myself with them. But they've made some difference. But the problem is that none of this would have ever happened if I had had all those other relational aspects to my life sorted out and I could rely on my culture to help me with those things before the psychosis happened. And I don't want to get ahead of myself though, because that's all the factors that went into it. My family and friends did their best to support me through that, but they put a lot of faith in doctors because that's what they do, because they've been socialized to do that, because that's how our system works. You trust the doctors because they are the experts, even though they're not in this case. And, I would trust a doctor to heal my broken leg. I would trust a doctor to help me deal with heart disease, but I do not trust doctors to understand what psychosis is because they just don't get it. Psychiatrists don't understand. Some psychotherapeutic professionals do understand, and those are the good ones. They understand it's a relational disorder. Carl Jung understood it. People like John Weir Perry understood it. People like Lionel Corbett understood it. I'm going to talk about those people further on in these videos. But before I do that, I might as well get into this video about what causes psychosis as far as I understand it. I will clarify again, I am not a doctor, definitely. I am not a psychologist. I don't have any accredited expertise in this field. I just have a lot of lived experience and a lot of things that I've witnessed. And I think that counts for something, because I know that the doctors really weren't able to help me very much aside from isolating me. An isolated person, isolated by COVID, they put me in a locked ward and they isolated me further. And as much as my family was able to visit, that was not what needed to happen. I needed to be around people. I needed to be in connection with people. And frankly, our entire society sucks at connection, and that's the problem. That's why we have an epidemic of depression. That's why we have an epidemic of loneliness. That's why we have an epidemic of anxiety. And that's why psychosis happens. And that's why homelessness and poverty happen too, honestly. That's why a lot of the problems that we have occur. Anyway, again, I'm getting ahead of myself. What causes psychosis? Well, there's a few organic factors, which I'll list them off just by process of elimination, so that we can get that out of the way. Physical trauma is a factor. If you have brain damage, whether from a head injury of some sort or from some neurological condition or disease, that can be a factor in psychosis. I'll talk about some of those factors a little bit as we go through this list. There is a genetic component. There's no single gene for schizophrenia or psychosis at all. People need to understand that it's not like they can isolate a gene, and it's not like some people have it and some people don't. It's more like there's a whole series of factors which are both genetic and environmental that go into making a susceptibility, a vulnerability to psychosis. And so those people are at maybe a higher risk of psychosis, but that doesn't mean they're going to get it. It doesn't mean that people who don't have those vulnerabilities aren't going to get it. And it doesn't mean that it runs in families like there's just one gene passed on from parent to child or anything like that. Your risk is higher if you have a family member that has psychosis, but again, it's hard to separate the difference between the genetic inborn factors and the factors that come from the environment that people are raised in. And that could include family things, but it also includes school and other factors like economic factors, poverty, and so on, and war and other kinds of trauma. So generally the accepted value on the difference between the nature and the nurture is about 50-50, so it's about 50% genetic and it's about 50% whatever, but that's really a ballpark figure that they've only found from twin studies. So the genetic factor of this is really it's really complex, but let's just say there is some susceptibility. I would say that everybody who has psychosis, generally speaking, they tend to be more sensitive people. They tend to be more emotionally open. They tend to be more empathic. That just seems to be a general trend that I've seen, and that's things I've witnessed from other people I've seen in psychosis. I know from myself, I'm a very open, sort of an empathic, emotionally sensitive person. I try to understand people. I try to live from my heart, and I think that as well as being open-minded and creative are factors that do kind of track with my proclivity to experience psychosis. Also, my proclivity to experience spiritual experiences and things like that. I don't think those things are unrelated. So, anyway, again, not to belabor the point, genetics is a factor, but it's not really conclusive. What else? What other organic factors can create psychosis? Well, malnourishment. If you don't have enough to eat, then you can go into psychosis. Actually, hunter-gatherer cultures in North America used to use starvation as a way of invoking a vision quest, much the same way as certain indigenous cultures will use entheogenic medicines, plant medicines, like ayahuasca or psilocybin, to induce a dreamlike spiritual experience. And this is very much like a psychosis experience, except it's controlled. It's done under supervised conditions and by experienced people, and so they were able to use these experiences as for spiritual growth, as a spiritual experience for understanding the psyche better, and as rites of initiation. And so that's really important, and we're going to talk about that also further in these videos, about the shamanic angle to psychosis experience, because that's really, really important to this, and it's really very much different than the whole biomedical model. But anyway, malnourishment can create psychosis, and so as people used it deliberately, it certainly can happen when people aren't deliberate about it. When people just don't have enough to eat, they can really suffer from that, and their brain goes into dysregulation, and then all kinds of things can happen. You start hallucinating, and getting strange beliefs and that kind of thing. Sleep deprivation is another factor in psychosis. Now, we can talk about what causes sleep deprivation, but sleep deprivation itself, they've done studies on this. If you don't sleep for several days, you will start to hallucinate. You will start to, your brain will not function properly, and there's a reason for that. We need sleep. We need sleep to regulate our brains. We need to regulate our entire physiology, to repair our bodies, and so forth. And if the brain can't do that, there's a lot of speculation as to what dreams are for. The brain, and some of those ideas have to do with the brain sort of organizing our experience and transferring experience from working memory into long-term memory and that kind of thing. And if your brain doesn't get that time to sort of clean the desktop, so to speak, or defrag the hard drive, then which may be happening during dreams or during sleep anyway, then it's going to have a problem. So sleep deprivation is a big factor. And then of course drugs and alcohol and withdrawal from drugs and alcohol can be a factor. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that many of the aforementioned drugs that are used as entheogens can also be used recreationally. Cannabis, psilocybin, LSD, all these sorts of things. Those certainly produce psychosis-like symptoms in people that are having them. Cannabis to a lesser degree, but in high amounts, very much so. And cannabis is actually a factor in psychosis. They've done studies and they know that people who are heavy users of cannabis have a higher risk of psychosis. And so, if you want to say that that's an organic component, I would say that probably is, and I would say be careful. Especially if you are a sensitive person that has complex trauma, because you might find yourself in psychosis. Cannabis was a factor in my first psychosis experience. I didn't know that I had CPTSD and other forms of trauma. That made it probably worse. And being an open-minded, creative, emotionally aware and engaged person, I think those all put me at higher risk. So, cannabis was a bit of a factor, and I have to be careful about using that recreationally, even though it's legal where I am and all that stuff. It's something to consider. So, also, electromagnetic stimulation can trigger psychosis experiences. There is a doctor at Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario, who uses something called the God helmet to stimulate the temporal lobes of the brain. And people have these weird feelings, like feelings of presence, like there's somebody in the room. They can have alien visitation experiences. They can have all kinds of spiritual experiences. That's why it's called the God helmet. They can have all kinds of things that are very dreamlike and very otherworldly, and those are very much psychosis-like experiences. So I would say those are also related to this experience that a person in psychosis is having. Something about the brain deregulating itself, or firing in a different way than it normally does under normal circumstances. And that can be induced by electromagnetic radiation. Sensory deprivation can also create psychosis experiences. If you're isolated and you don't have a lot of stimulation, that can be a factor. And that we'll talk about that as we get into the relational factors, because there's other circumstances that can cause deprivation of that kind. Stimulus deprivation. Like a lack of stimulation or engagement caused by isolation can also be a factor. Even though you actually have access to your senses, you can still your brain can be starved for activity, and that can really create a problem. But anyway, sensory deprivation. So people who go into a sensory deprivation tank, can, that usually you float in a bath of saline liquid, or when you're in a dark environment, usually your eyes are covered, that kind of thing. Your senses are all cut off, and your brain starts to confabulate. It starts to manufacture experiences for you to have, and that is seen as another route to spirituality. For sure, people do that deliberately. And also in the spiritual aspect, we could talk about Kundalini activation. So for anybody who's spiritually minded or knows about yoga, the idea of yoga, or one part of the yogic tradition, is that there's energy centers laid out up and down your body called the chakra system. And at the base of your spine, there is these latent energy sources called Kundalini, and they rise up. As you activate them, they rise up, and so this energy changes in your body, and that is associated with all these physiological changes in cerebrospinal fluid and the way that your physiology transforms itself, and somehow activates brain activity in the pineal gland and blah blah blah. And I'm getting into all these sorts of things that I don't really understand, but not very well anyway. But that's the idea, is that you can have spontaneous Kundalini awakenings, which can lead to very psychosis-like experiences, and that's what it's referred to. Like a psychosis might be almost identical with a Kundalini activation, depending on what culture you're in. So certainly the ways of dealing with it would be very different. Um, just by way of explanation, the way of dealing with a Kundalini activation in a lot of these traditional cultures is to ground yourself, to ground your energy as much as you can, to practice mindfulness, to be mindfully attentive, but maybe not too much, because to do it too much can be ungrounding. To eat a lot of root vegetables and heavy foods, which will ground your body and kind of you know what's the word? They'll apply a little bit of brakes to the effect of a Kundalini experience. So anyway, those are all organic factors that can go into it. So now that we've talked about the organic factors, let's talk about the relational factors. Um, what are some relational factors that can create psychosis? Well, isolation is well known to create psychosis experiences. That's why solitary confinement is considered a form of torture. Even though it's still practiced in many prisons in North America, um, solitary confinement is considered a form of torture. It isolates the person. It deprives them of sensory stimulation as well as social stimulation and relational stimulation, and that dysregulates the brain. We need contact with other people regularly in order to keep our brains healthy. It's that simple. Attention is the most important thing that we can get in life, next to air, and they've done studies on that. Infants who aren't touched die, and it's shocking that that was a revelation in medical science when they discovered that, mostly by studying, I think they studied orphanages in Romania after the war, um, or during the war, because these infants didn't have a lot of attention. The nurses were overworked because there were so many orphans from the war that they just couldn't tend to them all, and so they had a lack of physical touch and a lack of connection. Is what these kids would get sick and they would die. And that, so it's, next to air, attention is the most important thing we need. And so the fact that we can consider solitary confinement as a viable form of punishment is just absolutely barbaric. It will create psychosis. It will drive people nuts. And so it is a form of torture. Alienation and abandonment, emotional neglect, especially in childhood, emotional and physical abuse, gaslighting and manipulation. I mean, this is literally called crazy making behavior, when people are treated in such a way that they can't trust their own impressions and their own opinions. When they can't trust their own senses, they're constantly told that they're wrong, or that they're not valid, that they're not worthy. If they're constantly belittled and abused, and worse, if they're physically assaulted, that's even worse for invalidating people. And when people are invalidated, the psyche has to contend with that. It has to cope with that. It has to try to compensate somehow and deal with this problem. Like, how can you be invalid to yourself? It's a question even of your mere existence. And if you exist, that's a contradiction. It's a paradox that the brain tries to solve. And under times of stress, it can lead to psychosis. And if somebody's being gaslit out of their own experiences, they can be trauma bonded to somebody. They can lose connections. They can lose attachments. Or those attachments can be toxic, and they don't know how to stabilize themselves relationally, and that can lead to psychosis. So all of those things are factors. Confinement and limitation is also a factor. That's sort of dealing with this idea of a lack of stimulation, and all of it falls under the heading of emotional trauma. you know so all of these things are relational in nature. They can create stress that leads to sleep deprivation. They can create circumstances which lead to malnourishment or other forms of physical neglect. Um, they can create all these organic factors that we talked about before, can all be created by bad relationships and relational dynamics, right? We also have cultural factors, because a lot of people in our culture deal with poverty. We have a culture that emphasizes winning at any cost, and as a result, it calls that competition, when it's actually a form of predation, in my opinion. I think it's a real misnomer to call capitalist competition competition, because competition only exists between apparent equals or near equals. It doesn't happen when somebody's starving in the street. That's not competition. That's not a meritocracy. That's just flat out cold, you know? That's just abandonment. That's just cruel barbarity, in my opinion. But poverty creates a lot of conditions that create psychosis. So it leads to financial stress. So you have the anxiety about where your security is going to come from, your stability is going to come from. It can create malnutrition. It can create sleep deprivation. It can lead to drug abuse because people need to escape these circumstances. It leads to physical and emotional abuse because the stress of these problems create dynamics within families that lead to all these emotional traumas that we talked about before, you know, and it can lead to neglect of various forms, you know. So if you feel like you're being neglected by your culture, or if you feel like your whole family is neglected by your culture and doesn't count, then how are you supposed to relate well to the world? How are you supposed to feel secure and safe? How is your brain supposed to function? How are you supposed to make good decisions, you know? One of the things that people will say when they want to argue against measures that would help deal with poverty and help alleviate poverty because they don't want to pay for it and because they think it's not their problem because they're not going through it, they say that people have made poor life choices. Well, how are people supposed to make good choices if they have no good options? You know, it's really stupid. And poverty leads to all these other problems. So until we deal with poverty, we're going to constantly get mental illness. It's not a coincidence that depression is the leading cause of disability worldwide. People are overworked, they're isolated. We live in a culture that values competitive predation at any cost, and just flattens people basically because it doesn't care about people. It cares more about money than it does about people. And so then we wonder why everybody is suffering. You know, um, I don't know, call me crazy. But I would say people in psychosis are canaries in a coal mine of this. When there's problems in relational dynamics, the person who develops the mental illness is going to be the first person that's actually pointing to all of the relationship dysfunction that's occurring in the environment. So, in order to deal with that, in order to prevent psychosis, we need to treat those relational factors. We need to become more emotionally literate or emotionally intelligent. We need to help people understand what they're going through emotionally. We need to deal with the emotional conflict that can occur and all of the fear and control issues that emerge when people are not relationally stable. And by and large, people in our culture are not relationally stable. They are not emotionally literate. They are full of control issues. And those issues play out in our systems, they play out in our politics, they play out in our class divisions, in our dynamics. They create those poverty problems. It's all fear and lack of emotional literacy. And so all the other organic factors put together that are factors in psychosis they pale in comparison to all these other control issues and fear dynamics and relational problems that lead to all the other conditions that are going to create psychosis. So that was a bit of a ramble and a bit of a rant. Um, these videos are going to be, I think, and I'm just going to have to come to terms with that. I think my viewers will maybe understand. I hope they will. I hope you do. Um, but that's kind of how it is, and I hope this video has added to the discussion somehow. I hope it's maybe giving you some things to think about, and we'll see you in the next one. Thank you.